I am a narcotic or opiate addict in recovery. Uh, I used and abused opioids. I finally got help in 2005, and I am also I was a practicing physician. I went to medical school at Dalhousie and graduated in 1991. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me as I grew up, and then what happened and how I got involved in this, and then how things went from there. I was actually born in Peterborough, Ontario, but moved to Nova Scotia when I was only one. Moved to the island when I was 12. Came here in grade 7 and started at Queen Charlotte. Actually, I moved on October 31st, Halloween Day. And, coming to the island was hard at first. I was 12 years old. I'd moved from a country school where they had not even started French till grade 7. Everyone here in PEI had started in grade 4. So that was one of the things I really struggled with in the beginning, and probably the reason I never picked it up. But, the other thing I found very hard coming here was that I was from away. And I don't know if any of you have moved here, but it's difficult because by October, a lot of the cliques had started already and the groups had started, so I was an outsider. And I wasn't from some cool place. I was from a little place in Nova Scotia, so it took me a while to get some friends. I found grade 7 and 8 especially hard. And if I look back on it, I was really probably depressed all those days, but I didn't talk to anyone about it, just sort of stuffed it inside and dealt with it. But anyway, by grade 9, things came around for me. I ended up joining the basketball team at Queen Charlotte, and then I started to get more friends. And one of the things that have been that I was blessed with, that I grew up in a very good home. I did have that. A lot of people who ended up in my situations didn't come from a good upbringing, but I did. My father was a minister. So the one thing in my house was that I never ever saw alcohol or drugs at all. Neither my parents drank, my uncles and aunts never drank, my grandparents never drank. So I never saw substances used or abused at all. So it wasn't a fact of it was something that I'd seen done. When I graduated from Colonel Gray, I went to UPI for 4 years, and right before I went to UPI, I happened to go on a trip with my parents down to Boston. And when we were in Boston, I don't know if you've been to Boston, but it's where Harvard is and it's where MIT is. It's a very academic kind of city. And I went to the Science Museum when I was there, and I was 17 at that time, just getting ready to go to UPEI, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was good at math and physics, so I thought I'd be an engineer. But then when I went to this Science Museum, I went to the medical section and saw all these, basically human bodies, human people who had died, and then they had them all dissected out, and they showed all the muscles, and they showed all the anatomy and where the heart was and how babies formed and all this stuff. And I was fascinated with it, absolutely fascinated. And I thought, I want to learn this. So I remember buying this red medical dictionary. There was no Google back then. And I remember reading it all the way home and calling UPEI on my own and changing my major to biology, or sciences at least, because I thought I'll do 4 years of science and then try to get into medical school. So I did do that. And I got in 4 years later, and I went off to medical school in 1987. Now I'll talk to you about my drinking and stuff. I didn't drink a lot when I was in high school. In fact, I carried on a lot. I did. I like to just, pull pranks with my friends and do sort of fun stuff, but I wasn't a person that drank because it really wasn't around me. I did notice one thing about myself is I remember my first drink I ever had when I was 18 at the time, which was legal age back then, and it was graduation time from grade 12, and the one thing I noticed is when I drank very differently than the rest of my friends. I would typically get a couple of drinks in me, and then I would just keep drinking until there was none left. I wouldn't I see a lot of my friends drink and get sick or get stuporous, And, at the time, I really didn't realize that that may be an issue. I thought that it was good genes I had, good Scottish or Irish genes, and that this was something that I was able to do and it wasn't going to be a problem for me. But, was a warning sign, but I didn't even know that it was at the time. But as I said, just because of circumstances, I lived with my parents when I was at UPI. They were dead against alcohol, so I very infrequently drank, maybe if I was away. And then, the other fortunate thing that happened to me is I ended up, I had met a girl in high school, and right before I went to medical school, on my 21st birthday, I went out with her, and the typical drinking that I was at that time, I remember I decided I was going to drink 21 beer that night, but I ended up drinking 26. I was over in Halifax with her, and I remember getting sick in her aunt's washer and her not being very happy with me. And she said to me at that time, listen, if you're going to drink, I just can't be with you. And at that time, I hadn't progressed enough in what we call this disease, or I haven't go down that road enough that I just couldn't stop. So I thought about it and I said, yeah, I'll stop. So the whole time I was in medical school, I never had a drop of alcohol. But, the personality was still there. People who tend to end up with alcoholism, drug addiction, those kind of things, we tend to have all or nothing personalities. And we tend to be a bit of a perfectionist, and we want to do things to extremes whenever we pick up something. And I started doing that with studying. I became a studyaholic. I was studying constantly, which was great when you were in medical school. It was the perfect time to do it. And the other thing I did was I started running. And I went from running, a couple of kilometers a day. By my fourth year of medical school, I was running like 80 miles a week. But that was just this internal restlessness that I always had that I never quite knew what it was all about. I always felt like, even when I was in medical school and should be happy, I always felt like I needed to be somewhere else. Or I was rushing to get somewhere else, and then when I got there, I needed to rush to get to somewhere else. So I just felt that all the time. And the other thing that was very much taught to me all through and it was very big during the 70s and 80s, was we never talked about what was bothering us. Keep your feelings to yourself, and what happens at home stays at home. That was taught to me. And that, unfortunately, if anything was ever bothering me, especially as a guy, I would never tell anyone else, because that would be a sign of weakness. And so, whenever I would feel these feelings of uneasiness, the last person I would go to was my wife at the time. I was married at 22. And, so that's basically a bit of the history of what life was like. I got out of medical school and started my first practice. I started in Montague, PEI, and I worked there for 5 years. And I worked very hard when I was there. And I really, really enjoyed what I did. I really did. Now, what happened to me at about 10 years of marriage, I'm about 30 years of age, 32 years of age, and all of a sudden my marriage comes to an end. Combination of factors, my wife and I became very different people. I was working way too much, and we had some other big issues that just weren't getting resolved. And at that time, my marriage ended, and I had met someone else. And it's almost crazy to think that became such a big thing for me. And that's why I call the book The Golden Boy, because life for me had been so easy and sort of flawless. I hadn't even lost a grandparent as of yet. One grandparent, sorry, I'd lost one grandparent. I hadn't had to really deal with much. So when suddenly the major player in the family, who was me, I probably had the best job in the family, everyone came to me for everything, and I was sort of like the golden child. All my friends used to call me that. When I got divorced, it was like I felt so shameful and bad about myself. I felt like a piece of turd is what I felt like. That's exactly what I felt like. And I carried that around all the time. And I tried to compensate for it by working harder or trying to pour myself into this new relationship that I had, but I couldn't shake it. I wasn't living with my kids all the time. I was getting them on Wednesdays and every second afternoon, and that was not what I signed up for. I wanted my kids to be in my house all the time, but there was no way. I was the big income earner, and I had to earn the money to pay for everything. So I had to keep working, and I had to try to juggle this, and I felt terrible all the time. But I couldn't talk to anyone about it. I didn't dare talk to anyone about it. And my introduction to opioids was accidental. I was at a friend's house. He was another physician. It was a cold night in in January. We were going to a meeting, and I showed up at his place in Charlottetown, in Brighton, and I had this really bad chest cold, and I was coughing and coughing. And he just said to me, he said, "Grant, listen, you can't go to that meeting coughing like that. Why don't you go in the bathroom and take some cough medicine?" So I went into his washroom, and I opened the medicine cabinet. Don't look in people's medicine cabinets. I'm going to tell you that. Bad place to go, okay? Because in his medicine cabinet, there was a cough medicine. And in this cough medicine, I didn't even, to be honest, and doctors are bad for this, nurses are just as bad, okay? I looked at the medicine, I saw the dose in it, instead of thinking, okay, that's the dose, I think I might as well take twice as much as that, and maybe it'll work better. So that's what I did. I didn't really read what was even in it. But about 10 minutes later, as I was driving into a restaurant near the Delta, we were going to this conference, I suddenly felt this warm glow that just sort of immersed my whole body and sort of started at the tips of my toes and went right up to my head and basically made me feel numb from here up. And I just remember thinking at the time, all those bad feelings I had about myself, everything, the negativity, the worrying about my kids, because I was constantly worrying about them when they weren't with me, it just all washed away. It was gone. And I remember thinking, oh my God, what was in that cough medicine? Like, where has that been all my life? I remember thinking that. And the problem is you can't unfeel a feeling felt, just like you can't unsee something seen. And that registered in my brain. And I remembered that. And I went on that night, and I thought that I talked very well at this thing, asked good questions, and I remember reflecting on it as I drove home, because it had worn off by then. But basically what I was high. In that cough medicine was a liquid form of Percocet, or Percs. And they're used as cough suppressants because opioids are cough suppressants. In fact, they will suppress your cough so bad, if you take enough of them, you will stop breathing. And that's how people die with fentanyl overdoses or taking too much narcotics, because they are a respiratory depressant. That means they slow your breathing down. So that's what was in that medicine. And I found that out. And, being a doctor, everyone would think that I should have known better. But in hindsight, when I look back, when I walked out of medical school in 1991, I had 0 lectures on opiate addiction. None. In fact, I didn't even know what a Dilaudid, Percocet, or hydromorphone, or any of those, or Oxycontin. Didn't even know what they were. In fact, Oxycontin wasn't even invented. So I had never had a lecture. The only lecture I had on addiction was on alcoholism, and I had to go to one AA meeting to just see what it was like. And that was the extent of my education. So unfortunately, though, being the doctor, I thought I should know everything. And I thought I should know how to handle this kind of stuff. If anyone should know how to handle it, I understand the molecules, I understand the pharmacology of it, I should be able to do this. So what I started, it wasn't right away. What I started to do is I started to pick at it. What I would do is I had also developed a very sore ankle from running too much. I didn't know, but I'd had a stress fracture in my ankle. And so I started taking, some people had brought medications back to my office that they couldn't take. And lo and behold, one of the things that showed up back there was the cough medicine that someone couldn't take, and then some Percocet. And that became an issue. Access, because I had access to this stuff. So whenever I would get a pain or an ache, I would have something that I would take. And I noticed that I started taking it regularly. So for the first year of about 2001, I was taking half a Percocet about every 4 hours through the day, and it was managing my pain. And I thought this was great. But the only thing I would do is I would notice after a week of doing that, whenever I would try to stop it, I would feel horrible. I would start to get sweats, I would start to run to the washroom a lot, and I would just feel like I had no energy. And I never ever got that super warm feeling that I got before, but it just sort of made things manageable. But the problem was I was leaning on that, for everything. And I never even realized that I had an issue with it until I happened to go to a conference in 2002, April 2002 in Halifax. And I was sitting in the audience like you folks are with a bunch of other doctors. And we had, for the first time, a doctor give us a lecture on drug addiction, and it was in marine medical people. At that time, I was doing physical exams on usually men, who were going to offshore oil rigs. So they wanted to make sure that they were in great physical shape because they didn't want to have to be flying them in from the oil rig. And they didn't want someone out there that was going to be abusing substances because they'd be a danger to themselves or anyone else. So I got this lecture for the first time. And as he started to talk about the symptoms of substance abuse or opiate abuse, taking them in the morning to get out of bed, taking them for emotional reasons, increasing the doses for the same effect, taking them despite negative consequences. As he started talking about that stuff, I thought, oh my God, he's talking about me. Like, it was the first time that a light came on that I had a problem. And I remember phoning the guy, anonymously, of course. I called him afterwards and I said, listen, I think I have a problem. I said, what do I do? And he said, well, you should go tell somebody. And he said, you gotta stop them. And he said, you know what? I usually get a call like that from somebody every time I give that talk. So I did part of that. I was sort of in a tough situation because as a doctor, if I went and told another doctor that I had an issue with pain pills, they would have to report me and I'd lose my license. My name would go in the paper and it would just be a great big, I just couldn't bring myself to doing that. So what I did was I tried to hide it. And I did stop at that time. I hadn't been doing enough that I couldn't just stop. But the problem is that addiction does push-ups, is doing push-ups. As soon as you stop it, it's out there doing push-ups, getting stronger for you if you go back to it again. And I didn't understand that at all. I went to a doctor and told them I felt a little depressed. I needed a little time off so I could go through withdrawal. So I lied. How could the doctor help me if I wasn't telling them what was wrong with me? I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell my friends, nobody. I didn't go to a counselor, nothing. So I just stopped. And the summer of 2002 was tough because I had become so accustomed to just leaning on this stuff to basically cope with life. And here it was gone. So, I was getting through though. I was making it through the summer and everything was going okay. I'd gotten away from it and I was so glad that I was away from it because really at the end of it, I just needed it to feel normal. I didn't even need it to, I wasn't getting anything from it. And then September 30th, 2002, I was about 6 months sober. And my oldest brother, I have one brother, and I have one sister. My oldest brother walks into my office that day, and I'm standing there. And I remember he was sitting right across from me, and he has sunglasses on. He was a bit of a biker guy. He used to be a radio announcer. And I hadn't seen him a lot that summer because I was really isolating myself, trying to stay away from anything that was going on, because I was, had this whole opiate thing that I was trying to stay away from. And he comes into my office, and he looks like hell. And when I look at him, he's sweating, he's shaking. And my parents, I knew, had been in Halifax that day. And I said to him, I said, what the hell's going on with you? Like, what's wrong? And he said, Gran, he said, listen, I've been taking Dilaudid, which is a very strong opiate, for the last year for broken ribs. My doctor's in Italy. He's away till tomorrow. I need a prescription. I'm in withdrawal. And, at that time, to be honest, I just wanted him to get the hell out of my office. As soon as he said the words Dilaudid, which is an opiate, probably one of the strongest, I just froze. I could deal with other people talking about it, but when it was my brother and he was talking about the fact that he was using it, and I had no idea how much danger he was in when he was in withdrawal like he was. I had been in it myself, but I had never been in it like he was. And I had no idea. And when I play the whole thing back to myself, I know all the mistakes I made. I know them now, but at that time I was trying to do the best I could. I remember he said to me, well, can I go to outpatients? I said, no, they probably won't give them to you. I offered for him to go see a doctor that I had talked to before, but I know he couldn't get in that day. And then I remember the last things he said to me is he said, well, can I drink? And I said, well, I guess maybe you can drink, and maybe that'll help some of your symptoms, and then you can see him the next day. Just so you know, that's the wrong answer, okay? You have anyone who's in narcotic withdrawal and they pick up alcohol, they're just going to abuse the living hell of it trying to get out of it. And I didn't know that at the time. About 6 o'clock that evening, I remember walking into my deck and getting sort of a sick feeling in my stomach. I don't know what it was, but I just felt like I didn't handle that right. I should call him. He lived in Kensington. It was hunting season the next day, so I knew he'd be getting ready to go hunting because he liked hunting. 9:15 that night, his wife called. She was crying hysterically. He had flipped his truck half a kilometer from his house, broke his neck, and he was dead. And it was just like, oh my God, I just killed my brother. That's exactly how I felt. He was drinking and driving, dropped his cell phone, went to get it, went off the road, and was dead instantly. I went out that night. I had to go tell his daughter, who was 18. Then I had to go tell my parents. And then I remember driving to the morgue in Summerside to see him because I had to see him. And the thing I think that's always very ironic is you would think that when I smelled the alcohol off his breath and I knew that he had just died when I saw him there, I kissed his forehead and I could smell it. You'd think that would have scared me off the opiates. But over the next 10 days, I became first I had to go to the wake, and I saw how devastated my parents were, how devastated his daughter was, and I just felt like I had caused this. Even though everyone was telling me I wasn't, my disease, now that I know all this, was just playing with that and making me feel as bad as I could. I felt so guilty. And it took only 10 days. And I remember at that 10th day, it was a Saturday. He would have died on Monday, so it would have been like about 10 or 11 days afterwards. And I remember sitting on my bed, and I had, in my cabinet, I had a whole bunch of medications because I would use them for people that I would have to go see and stuff. And I remember there was OxyContin in there then. And at that time, they were telling us that OxyContin was less addicting than the short-acting Percocets and stuff because it's long-acting. It lasts for a longer time, so people don't have to take as much. And that's what they were telling us. And so that's what I picked up. And that was October of 2002. And I'll tell you, that sent me into a 2.5-year spiral. I started snorting them. I started getting other stuff. I started crushing them. I started injecting them. And by the summer of 2003, I was a full-blown IV drug addict, using every 3 hours around the clock. I would have to use just to feel normal. There was no fun in this anymore. Basically, the drug had just hijacked my brain and taken over, and I needed it to even get out of bed. If I didn't have it, I would be laying there in a pool of sweat and shaking, and I couldn't function. So I did this for 2.5 years. And at first, I'd be going to pharmacies and buying dilaudid vials for the office and using that. But at the end of it, I started getting so desperate that I even went to this was a person who wouldn't give a prescription to his brother when he was sober. But when I started using myself, at the end of it all, I was even buying them off my patients, people who I prescribed stuff for. So that's how this twists your mind into doing things. All the things I always said I wouldn't do, you mix drugs in there and you mix drug addiction, you end up doing them. Every single one. People told me that, and I didn't believe them. How did I get help in 2005? You know how I got help? I got help because I was forced to get help. I was lucky. Because I had a college where all the doctors were looking at it, and everyone knew something was wrong with Grant Matheson. Grant Matheson was not acting like Grant Matheson. Grant Matheson is all over the place. And I was. I'd be high up sometimes, if I was feeling good, and then if I was out of stuff, I could barely move. And people didn't know what was wrong, but they knew something was wrong. So they started drug testing me, and I cheated on them. That's one of the things that this disease does, is it will use any talent you have. So if you're very ingenious and can come up with ways, like I came up with a way to put clean urine in a tube and with a bulb syringe and inject it into a thing, so when they were doing witness urines on me, I could still give them clean urines. And it was just, that's how crazy it was. I was doing that just to keep myself sick. I tried so many times to stop myself. And you would think, this guy's a doctor, he's got to know how to stop this stuff. I tried. It is impossible to stop without help from other people. It is impossible. Let me tell you, I have tried, and I have watched many of my friends try. And it's not successful. And how I ended up getting help was I ended up going to a place called Homewood in Ontario. And the reason I had to go there, they wouldn't let me go to Mount Herbert, is because that place specializes in doctors and nurses and health professionals in general with addictions. Because we have, one of the things that we have that's a little different is when we come back out afterwards, we're going to have this medication all around us. And we have to deal with the guilt associated with the fact that we were practicing and using this stuff, that we probably diverted some from other people, which I did. And so it was a very good place for me to go. And I'll tell you, it was scary. In 2005, I did not want to go to that place. I remember doing everything I could so I didn't have to go. In fact, what they did was they set up a thing, at first, how I ended up getting caught and ended up there was the first time I went up for an addictions assessment in the middle of May of 2002. What happened was I had stayed there for one night at a bed and breakfast, and I had to go back for an assessment the next day, and that whole night I was drinking and doing drugs in my room, and then going for an assessment the next day, like some sort of idiot. Like I was just going to, breeze into this thing and breeze out of it, and there were going to be no one was going to catch on. But what happened was, while I was at the second session in the afternoon, instead of leaving the room and cleaning it all up like I normally did, for some reason, I just stuck a do not disturb sign on the door and walked down to Homewood. And this bed and breakfast, although it wasn't part of Homewood, they had had enough people connected to Homewood. When they went inside my room and saw what was in there, they phoned Homewood. So I was sitting there, and I heard this knock at the door. And suddenly, I found myself up in this office of this Scottish doctor, who was an older fellow who had been in recovery from alcoholism for about 30 years. And he had me sitting there, and he had the 12 other people who had seen me, done physicals on me, asked me all these questions about addictions, and I'd lied to all of them. And he had them all sitting around the room, and he confronts me with this stuff. So he says, Grant, he said, bed and breakfast people found white powder in your room and bottles of booze. He said, how did that get there? What, can you believe what I said? This is what I said. I found it there. I was just looking at it, wondering what it was. And you know how ridiculous that sounds? Like, that's how stupid I got. At the end of it, I just became stupid. And then I remember him, in a very compassionate way, saying, listen, Grant, I've been there. I know that you don't want to say what's happening, but the only way we can help you is to tell me. And for the first time in all those years, I laid out exactly what I was doing. I told him I was using IV drugs. I told him I was drinking to try to get off drugs as well at the time, which I was trying to do. And I felt like, and he described it, I felt like I had been juggling all these plates for all this time, and finally I could just sort of step back and let them fall. I felt like this big weight was off me because I had finally told my truth. And he said, listen, you're sick. You're not bad. You're sick, and you need to come in for treatment. So there wasn't a bed that day. I flew home back to Charlottetown. I had a friend who's an RCMP, who's a cop, in Halifax, come over and stay with me for the week before I went back to Homewood, and that was a good thing he did. Because I'll tell you, one of the most dangerous times for drug addicts is the week before they go into rehab. They often will go on one last blast, and they often end up overdosing and dying. So I'm glad my friend came over and stayed with me. He had no idea what had been going on, but he knew that he needed to be there. I ended up back in Homewood on May 23rd, 2005. And I talk about it in my book in 2005. The last time I ever used IV drugs or ever used opioids, period, was in the Montreal airport in 2005. And that's the opening scene in my book. And the reason I talk about that, because it was a particularly low place for me. I was standing there waiting for my flight to go. I had flown from Charlottetown to Montreal, and I was waiting to take this Montreal to Toronto flight to get to my rehab. And I knew that I couldn't get on that airplane if I didn't use, because I had slipped through security with a needle full of stuff in my pocket. But I knew I needed to get it into me, because if I didn't get it into me, I'd go in withdrawal on the airplane. So as they called for the flight, I rush into the bathroom. As I go into the men's washroom, there's only one stall in there, and the place is full of people because they're all trying to go to the bathroom before the flight. I end up pushing by everybody in that thing. I remember almost knocking them over and getting into the stall, locking it, and then thinking, okay, I got to cook this stuff up and take it. But I needed water. And I look around. There's no sink in this stall. There's nothing. The toilet's attached to the wall. The only source of water I had was from the toilet bowl. And that's what I used. That's how sick I was. This was a guy who ran marathons and would only eat healthy and was in fantastic shape when I was in my 20s. And here I was injecting toilet water with Dilaudid into my veins. But thank God that was the last time I used. I ended up going to Homewood. I ended up in Homewood that afternoon. And I'll tell you, it isn't easy going through opioid withdrawal. The nice thing about a treatment center is what they did was they gave me methadone for the first week. You know, a lot of people take that go on it for the rest of their life, but I was fortunate. I got it for the first week just to take the withdrawal away. And the other thing that really, I think the big 4 things that happen when you go to treatment. First of all, they told me I was sick. I wasn't a bad person. Like, I really thought that I was this morally corrupt degenerate that deserved to die this way. I really did. And I thought I was just going to die with this. I didn't care about anything else anymore. The drug had taken away all my friends. It had taken away all my money. It had wrecked my relationship with my new wife that I had at the time. And it was just about to take my career away from me. So I was feeling pretty low, but at least I knew I was sick with something. And he said, you need treatment. So I was in the right place. The other thing that I liked about this place was there was 84 people in there going through the same thing I was. And they were all at different stages. There'd be 20 come in every week. So there were some people there that were like 3 weeks sober. And to me, they were like gods. Like, man, I couldn't get 3 to 6 hours, let alone 3 weeks. So when I saw those people, like, it gave me hope. I thought, gosh, if they can do it, maybe I can do it. And I think that's why this works so much better when there's other people. People think they can do it by yourself, but you can't. Because when you're feeling miserable for those 5 seconds and you feel like you want to go do something, you just talk to someone else and they tell you it'll get better. And that's what helped me. In my book, I talk a lot about Homewood and my time there. So I won't get into all of that here because a lot of it's personal stuff. I met a lot of people there that, in more personal interactions, I met a lot of people there that really, really helped me. You know, I had one girl in particular, her name was Dancer, that I got very close to when I was there. And the reason I got close to her was her and I came in at the same time, so you sort of got close to the people that were in at the same time as you. Plus, she was an intravenous drug user. So we both had my arms were full of track marks up and down my arms. It was crazy. But she had the same marks, so it wasn't so, I wore short sleeves for the first time in 3 years when I went there. And I wasn't scared of them anymore. And other people had them, so I felt a little free and I felt like I could talk about it. And a big change for me, because everyone told me you're as sick as your secrets, and Grant, when you're there, you need to talk about what's bothering you. And I remember the first weekend I was there, Dancer and I go for a walk. And I just call her Dancer because I don't want to tell her name. I do that in my book because this is anonymous, so I don't tell people's names. She is the one person I asked before I wrote this book if I could use her story. Because the next story, she tells me this story while we're walking around the grounds. She starts to cry. I don't even know her that well, but she starts to cry. But she's opening it up to me because she can see that I understand because I have been there. And she says, Grant, and she starts crying. She said, I can't believe I let that happen. And I said, what? What happened? And she told me that 3 weeks before, she had been driving home. She was high as a kite. A cop pulled her over. Her boyfriend was a dealer. He knew that. He knew she was an addict. And he ended up raping her in the back seat of her car. And as he shut the door on her, he said to her, you're nothing but a drug addict. No one's going to believe a word you say. And if you tell anyone, I'll have a SWAT team at your house in 10 minutes. And she just started crying and crying because she blamed herself for that. And I said, I almost said her name there. I said, Dancer, I said, this is not your fault. That was not your fault. I said, you need to go to group and talk about this. And talk about it with other people. And she did do that. And she stopped blaming herself for it, because blaming yourself for these things and the things you do in addiction makes you just want to do more. And I saw the relief that she got from that. And I saw how she started to laugh again, and she was happier. So I started talking about the things that bothered me, about the fact that I felt like I abandoned my family when I got divorced and my kids, about the fact that I felt like I killed my brother and still blame myself for that. In fact, I almost resented him and hated him because of it, because it really impacted my life, and and I felt guilty about that. I felt bad that I'd let down my parents, that I wasn't the golden child anymore. I really, every time I saw my mother, I felt so ashamed all the time, and I needed to talk about that. And they taught us how to do things like to write all our emotions down, write letters to people. I remember writing a letter to my brother. These are no-send letters. I write them just to get the emotions on paper. And then we would ceremoniously sit around, the group of us, and we ended up burning them at a little bonfire later on. But it was all very healthy, and it taught me to start to talk. And it started, and the big thing that I learned there is that everybody's got a story. Everybody has something wrong with them. You know, no one is perfect. And certainly not these people, because they all ended up in rehab. But, you know, it's in life in general. You know, I was going around with this mask of trying to be perfect all the time, and I was making myself sick because I was always trying to meet up to that expectation that everyone else had on me instead of just living my life. And that's what I started to learn. And that's what I learned in rehab. And the other thing they helped me in rehab is they introduced me to 12-step meetings with AA. There's Cocaine's Anonymous. There's Narcotics Anonymous. I didn't even know these existed. In Charlottetown, there's an AA meeting 3 times a day. Can you believe that? 3 times a day. There's a Narcotics Anonymous meeting every day of the week except for Sunday. Every single day. I had no idea. And here I was a doctor. I had no idea. I came back to PEI, and it wasn't easy at first. You know, the person that I had gotten a new relationship with, they were using, and I really wanted nothing to do with them. I asked an older person in recovery, this older gentleman who went to AA meetings, what I should do, and he said, listen, just be an example for her, and if she wants help, she'll get it. And sure enough, August of that year, which would have been about 3 months later, she came to me and said, listen, can you take me to a meeting? And I took her, and she's been sober since. But the thing is that because we were so codependent in drugs, our relationship ended after that. And in December of that year, 2005, we split up, and I was feeling pretty bad. And I was still going to meetings, and I was still thinking, I was still meeting with all my friends and doing all the things I thought I should be doing. But the one thing that was registering in the back of my head and kept playing this little tape through was I kept thinking, okay, I think I just drank too much because of the drugs. I think that I could probably handle drinking again. So I remember a friend of mine decided we're going to go to Moncton. He was also a year and a half sober. And we're going to go to Moncton and just have one more last rip. You know, why not? Before I get into this whole recovery thing too much and I can't drink anymore. And it happened to be my brother's birthday, January 21st, the guy who had died. So I think that was adding to everything else that was bothering me at the time, the relationship breakup and this. So I go. I remember stopping at the Board and Liquor store, picking up some Fireball, and I thought I'm going to get something that I can't drink fast, so I got myself 1.5 liters of Hock Tallow wine, because I thought I can't drink that fast. I remember parking the car in a parkade, drinking the Fireball while we were driving to get there, and as I got out of the parkade in Moncton, I tried to get in a taxi, and he told me I couldn't take the bottle of wine in with me. So what did I do? I chugged it right there on the sidewalk. 1.5 liters of wine. And I tossed the bottle in the garbage. And you know what? I don't remember anything after that until I woke up in a jail cell the next morning. And here, I wake up in this jail cell. I look around me. I don't have my shoes on. I don't have a coat with me. I'm just laying on this metal slab. And I'm thinking, what the hell happened? I have little pictures of things in my head, but I have no idea. And I remember saying to the cops, I said, can you take me to my vehicle? And they said, you don't remember what we told you about last night? And I said, no, what happened? And they said, your friend, you got separated, you were walking in the freezing cold, that's why we picked you up. You ended up in a jail cell, he ended up looking for you. He smashed your vehicle, it's burnt, and he's paralyzed from the waist down. One night of drinking. He's still in a wheelchair today. That was in 2006. That's what relapse can do. You've abused one substance and you and go pick up another one. Same thing happened to me that happened to my brother, except I happened to be lucky enough to get picked up by the cops and not freeze to death out walking in minus 20-degree weather. It wasn't that I was being a jerk. Actually, I was just being stupid. I just walked out of a bar, took my shoes off, and started walking down the street with no coat on. That scared me. I thought, I got to do something about this. I got really, really scared, and I started to go to meetings regularly. I started doing all the things that I need to be doing. The big things, recovery is not that hard. It's simple, but it's hard, okay? You have to learn to do a couple things. You have to stop hanging around with the people you used to hang around with. That's hard. Some of them I thought were really good friends, but in the end, I found out they weren't my friends at all. They wanted me because I had money on me or I had drugs on me. That's why they wanted me. The other thing I had to do is I had to make sure that I always told people about what was going on with me. So when I go to parties, people wouldn't be offering me drinks all the time because that's what they do. And it was hard. Being a doctor in a small community and going to meetings where there's other people who were taking pills that they usually got from doctors and got in trouble was hard. And, I can't say it was easy, but I can tell you it was certainly worth it. Every day got better and better. And by 2007, I ended up going back to work as a physician. I started out slow at first, and then I started up full-time again in 2008. And then, lo and behold, one of the people that I had been buying medications from, one of my patients, went and reported me, of course, because I had been doing something wrong. And then I got charged for that from 2004. So here I was, 2008, sober, trying to work again, and then I had these charges to face. But you know what? I knew I was guilty. What could I do except admit that I was guilty? And that's what I did. I basically said, yes, I was guilty. And, going through court is a very humbling experience, but it was good for me. I never cried so much as I did on that stand apologizing. And I was very fortunate that the judge gave me a 2-year conditional discharge, which basically means if I had to go to a probation officer for 2 years every month, and I had to go and do some community service that they told me to do, and I had to remain clean for 2 years. And I had urine samples done all the time. I was getting them done anyway because the doctors were doing it every week on me to make sure I was able to work. And you know what? I got through it. I got through all that because I kept going to meetings and I kept talking about it, and I made it through. So you can face these things sober, and I did. Now what happened to me, and I'll be totally honest with it, my recovery hasn't been perfect. In 2011, I got away from meetings. I stopped doing anything. I stopped doing talks like this. I wasn't doing talks like this, but I stopped talking at AA meetings and speaking. And I ended up starting to drink again. And it started pretty slow. It all started, I remember I was single at the time. I was with a girl from Quebec, and we had gone away on a trip, and I hadn't told her I was an alcoholic or an addict. I hadn't told her that yet. Because I didn't want, it's a hard thing to tell people, but you sort of have to for your own protection. And I found that out the hard way. Because I remember she said to me, well, I know you don't drink, but surely you can have a beer. And I thought in the back of my head, God, it's been 6 years since I had one. Maybe I can. And you know what? This was 2011. I got away with it the first night. I only had a couple. But then I started picking at it and picking at it and picking at it. And then I popped a positive urine test for alcohol, of course, because I'm going to be drinking more. And then they suspend me again. And once they suspended me in 2012, at that time, I thought, man, I'm suspended. I can drink as much as I want. That's how it takes over. Totally took over. I ended up drinking 4 liters of wine and 2 quarts a day, every day, from February until September. Every day I would say that 4 liters of wine is going to do me the whole day. I would buy a big, big box because I thought, I can't drink that. There's no way I can drink that. By 2 o'clock, it would be gone almost every day. Like, it was insane. It just is unbelievable how it just takes over. And even when you get up in the morning, you say you're not going to do it, bang, I'm at the liquor store before it's even open. It was crazy. How did I get help the second time? My family pulled an intervention on me. My kids would have been no older than, they were 16, 18, and my youngest was way too young, but she wasn't involved in it. But my ex-wife was there, my present girlfriend, my friends, my parents, and they had gotten this a priest who was 25 years sober to run this thing. I remember sitting there Labor Day weekend and wonder, why is everyone hanging around? And suddenly my daughters start reading letters to me, and they are talking about how they can't sleep at night because they're so worried about me. And I'm back at Homewood again the next day. And I knew what I needed to do. You know, it sucks going through alcohol withdrawal. It really does. It's actually very, very dangerous. Alcohol withdrawal, you can have seizures and die. So they ended up giving me some stuff for that, and I ended up doing the exact same thing, start going to meetings, start talking about what was bothering me, and, you know, and I haven't drank since. So after this time, I decided whether I wasn't going to go back to work this time. And the reason I decided I wasn't going to go back to work is because I wanted to write a book. And I knew if I was going to write a book that the legal community for doctors typically won't let us talk about anything. You know, it's usually the way it is. Even for my court cases, I couldn't give interviews, nothing. They just want you to shut up. So I knew that I'd have a lot of, you know, sort of, I'd be handcuffed a little bit if I was still working. And the other reason I didn't go back to work is that I just felt like the pressures of work, just the whole pace of it all, just was not conducive to me being healthy. Because recovery is a day-at-a-time thing. You know, I think that was the biggest thing that saved me, besides getting involved with everyone else, was doing this a day at a time. I had to learn to just break it down when I was trying to get off this stuff, to just do it for the next hour, Grant. Get through the next hour, you know, and then just get through today. And then when I wake up the next day, you just have to get through that day. And then you string those days together, and you get some time in. And it really isn't until you get some time in that your brain starts to heal, and you start to realize some of the crazy things you were doing was because of the disease. Because these chemicals hijack your brain. There is no other way to say it. Opioids will take over your thinking. You can have somebody who, you know, if you give them to anyone for a week, you will become physically dependent on them, if not emotionally. Addiction, by definition, is doing the same thing over and over despite negative consequences, okay? So if I'm using opioids and I'm missing work and I'm sick all the time, I'm addicted to them, okay? That's very plain. If I'm drinking and I end up getting impaired charges and I'm beating up people, and then I have a problem with alcohol, you know? It's pretty simple. That's a pretty simple definition to remember, folks. You know, if you're doing something over and over, even in a relationship, if you're in a relationship and negative things are happening to you in the relationship all the time, and you still keep going back to it, you've got a problem, and you probably need some help to get you out of it, because our minds are so warped by addiction of whatever it is that we can't truly think through it, and we need someone else to point it out to us. And that's why we need to get help. That's why you have counselors here, okay? If you have things going on that are bothering you, it doesn't even have to be addiction stuff. Go talk about it. If you get nothing else from me today, okay, it is the fact that there are other human beings in this world for a reason. They are there for us to learn from, okay? We don't know all the answers, okay? And a lot of people can just tell us, because we don't have to touch the hot iron to know it's hot. A person has done that already, okay? They've already touched the iron and it's hot. So we know it's hot. We don't have to do it. And if we can learn from other people's mistakes before we make them. And I'll tell you the one thing with opiates, from this doctor who knew everything about them and who had no addiction problems in his past, they will take over. If you're a guy, you'll end up committing crimes to pay for them. If you're a girl, 95 to 98% of them sell themselves to pay for them. I had a girl 2 months ago I met with who was just getting into this stuff, and I talked to her about this. I warned her all these things. Addicts end up in 3 places: jail, treatment, if you're lucky, or dead. That's where you end up. And, you know, I can tell from my personal experience, I was lucky enough that I ended up in treatment, because I almost ended up dead several times. Now, our time is running out. I know it's almost out now. I'm very, very willing to answer questions. Some of this has been videotaped right now, but we're going to shut that off for the questions, so you have, so don't worry about your question being videotaped or anything like that. Anything you say to me always stays with me. The only time I ever have to tell anybody is if you said you were going to hurt yourself or someone else. That's the only way. I'm not a doctor anymore. I still have my MD, but I don't practice as a physician. So I tell you things, anything I tell you is from my experience as a drug addict and an alcoholic, because that's what I am. You know, I'm in recovery for those things, but I've been down that road. So feel free to ask me any questions. If you don't feel like sticking your hand up here and asking them, you can come up afterwards or ask me. And the other place you can always get me is on Facebook. It's Grant Matheson. You can just message me, and I usually message back the same day. I'm an open book, folks. You know, if you folks want to chat with anyone, I usually try to encourage you to go to your counselors at school, talk to your parents. If you don't feel like you can talk to your parents, find a friend that you feel like you can talk to that you trust. You know, the big thing is we need to be talking. We don't need to be so hard on each other, because none of us are perfect. Remember that. Thank you.